All right, great. It's a minute or so after noon. So thank you all so much for coming for the last lecture in the Drug Discovery Lecture Series. I hope you have learned a lot over the last 10 or 12 weeks or so. So we're kind of going to finish up by something that a lot of people are curious about but don't really know much about. So it's how to apply for an IND. So IND stands for Investigational New Drug Application. And we have an office here that's sponsored by the CCTS that can help you with INDs on campus. So that office used to consist of Penny Jester, myself, and Dunya Ritchie, but Penny unfortunately retired, well, fortunately for her. So now it's me and Dunya. And I'm not a clinical scientist at all, but I'm very anal retentive, and I like rules. So it kind of, works out to help with IND applications. Dunya is an editor, and she's very good at document management, because to apply to the FDA, it just has to do with a lot of paperwork, forms, things like that. I always tell investigators, if they can apply for an R01 at the NIH, they can apply for an IND. It's not rocket science, it's just very tedious. So we'll kind of go through some concepts today. I'll start with what the purpose is of an IND, according to the FDA, what types of INDs exist, when you actually need one, and sometimes you actually surprisingly don't. If you do need one, how do you actually apply them for one, and how do you then manage one? So I actually printed out some paperwork that we'll just kind of go through as a group, because it makes it just kind of tactile. What are the different pieces and parts of an IND application that you can kind of look at? Also, we support IDEs. Those are investigational device exemptions. So they're like INDs for devices. The rules are a little bit different, but in the majority is the same as INDs. It's actually a little bit less structured than INDs. INDs have a lot of different forms for different pieces. Whereas the first time I did an IDE with FDA, they just said, well, just send us what you think we need to know, which was a bit, frightening for us, but we got it approved. So the purpose of an IND, here at the first bullet point, it's actually an exemption from the law, because the law requires an approved marketing application for drugs to allow clinical testing across state lines. So in theory, if you were manufacturing a drug here within the state of Alabama and you would treat patients within the state of Alabama, you wouldn't need an IND. Now, I think everybody at UAB would get really nervous if you did that. So I think it's still sometimes a good idea, if not by law required, to still go to the FDA and get approval to, go into humans. And this is a language that's on the FDA website. So federal law requires that a drug be the subject of an approved marketing application, again, that word, before it is transported or distributed across state lines. Because the sponsor, so somebody wants to do a trial, will probably want to ship the investigational drug to clinical investigators in many states. It must seek an exemption from that legal requirement. So the IND is the means through which the sponsor technically obtains this exemption. So it's really kind of a waiver that you're almost asking from the FDA. So what does the FDA then look for when they receive an IND application? Their main purpose is to assess that the proposed protocol is not unnecessarily risky. So what they're going to look at is your preclinical data that you have for safety, so mostly your toxicology studies in different species. They are going to look at the investigators' qualifications. Are they really an MD? Have they done this before? Things like that. And then they also will look at, what's the purity of the drug? What kind of testing have you done that you always get the same quality when you do different batches of the drug? How stable is it when you have it sitting on the bench for 3 months? Is it the same as when it's made fresh? And it's especially important for biologicals as well. Biologicals many times can also be in solution, so you can imagine that bacteria can start growing in there. So you need to have all these components in your application. And that's why the application consists of different sections, and I go through those, where the FDA will actually look at those particular aspects of your IND application. Now, interestingly, most people don't really notice, the FDA doesn't care if your drug works in animals. They're not going to look at that for an IND. They want to know what the toxicity profile is in animals, absolutely. But they're not going to look for efficacy. Mostly because there's, the whole translation, if it works in an animal, does it work in a human? How do we know? Many times we don't. So you actually do not have to prove that it works in an animal before you can get an IND, as long as you have an acceptable toxicity profile. You also don't need to know how your drug works. And it's also a misconception. Now, again, from your personal or institutional standpoint, it costs a lot of money to run trials and do drug discovery programs and so on. So in order to invest in a program, you probably want to know what the mechanism of action is, but the FDA doesn't care. They care, again, mostly about safety, safety, safety. So there's a couple of permissions that you need to have to conduct a clinical trial. So as the sponsor, and I'll talk about what the sponsor is in a second, you have to have a couple of different permissions. Of course, you need to get permission from the FDA for the IND, but you also need permission from your IRB to do the study. You need both. And you can actually apply for those in parallel. You can also first go to your IRB and then get approval and then go to the FDA, or vice versa. The IRB will actually not give you full approval if they determine that you need an IND until you have that IND in place. So they will give you a letter that says, okay, we approved it pending, your approved IND application from the FDA. But you can also actually do it side by side. Now, the only chance is there that sometimes you get comments back from both the FDA and the IRB to change your protocol, and you would have to integrate those and then have to go back to both of those agencies to make sure they agree with the final version.
So
Sure.
IRB is still institutional committee, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's not from federal.
No. Mm-hmm. Yeah, unless it's a single IRB or maybe the Western IRB, you can outsource your IRB work, but UAB has an IRB. Most of the UAB protocols will probably go to the UAB IRB. Now, maybe you need other approvals as well. Let's say you do a gene therapy protocol. You will need permission from an institutional biosafety committee. So just IRB and IND may not be enough. It just depends on the type of study that you're going to do, what other approvals you may need. Now, let's talk about the definition of sponsor for a second, because there's some confusion about this. Most of us are in the research space, and when we think about a sponsor, we think about who funds the study. That is different than the sponsor definition in IND speak. The sponsor is actually the entity that takes on responsibility of executing and monitoring the trial. So it can be an individual physician, it can be an institution like UAB, or it can be an industry partner. It does not necessarily have to be who funded for it. So you can have maybe NIH funding to run a clinical trial, but UAB is the sponsor. Or maybe, a doctor here on campus is the sponsor. And we're actually having active discussions with senior administration to what extent UAB would like to have UAB be the sponsor and not individual investigators. Kind of a parallel with when you apply to NIH, OSP and UAB is actually the grantee, not you as the PI. It's kind of just, we're trying to see if we want to do something similar for INDs. In our office, we actually have Chris Brown sign off. Go ahead. Yeah.
I think a sponsor is easier to understand the institution industry,
Mm-hmm.
because my mind thinks sponsor, they give some money,
Mm-hmm.
but how the individual physician maybe also give money?
No, so the sponsor has nothing to do with money.
Oh, so here,
Yeah, so here's different. So the sponsor here is who takes responsibility.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's irrespective. So you can have NIH provide the money, and you as an individual PI or UAB be the sponsor, as the entity that takes responsibility for executing the trial according to rules, laws, regulations, and things like that. Yeah. So sometimes individual physicians here are the sponsor, sometimes UAB is the sponsor, and we as an office have elevated this to, the level of, vice president's office. We're like, you probably need to make some unifying decision one way or the other, because right now it's a little bit of the Wild West. Some individuals are, sometimes UAB is like, no, we want to be a sponsor. Some different institutions have different rules. There's not one way that's perfect. It just depends on the institution. One reason why UAB may want to be the sponsor is when you sign the cover sheet, and I'll talk about this, in Form 1571. Sometimes it's also called the go to jail form. And that is because whoever signs that sheet takes legal responsibility for doing the study. And that's, if you willfully, put in faulty information in the application and things like that, you could go to jail. And that's why, there's kind of legal implications of who the sponsor is. Did you have a question?
Yeah, when UAB as a sponsor, so do UAB have to hire other institutes to do the investigation?
No.
No.
So we, in our office, probably 80% of the INDs that we've helped with, UAB is the sponsor, and then a UAB physician is actually doing the trial. So it's all with, but UAB is like the signatory on the IND and then taking a legal responsibility. And then the PI, like with the grant, a grant from NIH comes to UAB and then the PI actually executes the grant. Right.
What is is there a rule for when the UAB takes responsibility from the PI?
No, there's not, and that's what we're trying to clarify, because within the cancer center, there's another IND support group, and they typically just have the PI be the sponsor. Throughout our office, we've had discussions with compliance a couple of years ago when Dr. Marquez was still the VP, that UAB wanted to be the sponsor. So we route everything through the VP office. Not only adds, a day or two for signing, but sometimes that day or two is actually kind of important. So that discussion is being actively investigated right now.
But UAB wouldn't necessarily, if you want to, so you want UAB to be sponsor, they wouldn't necessarily throw you out.
No.
So you can't.
No. Yeah. So what happens after you've submitted things to the FDA? And I'll talk about the content a little bit later, but just to kind of set the stage of the process as a whole, is the FDA will send you a receipt or acknowledgement letter. So it arrives usually 1 to 2 weeks after they actually receive it. We send it to the document room. And in that letter, it assigns you your IND number, and that will be the number that's associated with the IND for the life of it. And it gives the date of the receipt. And sometimes we just use when FedEx sends us a notice, oh, your package was arrived in Maryland. But this date of receipt that they give in the letter is the actual official receipt date, because there's a clock that starts ticking on that receipt date. So once the FDA sends you this letter, it's actually not an approval to begin. This is just a letter, we got it, we're going to look at it, and we will take 30 days. And you are not allowed to start this trial until 30 days after that receipt date. Now, sometimes they will send you a notification earlier, everything looks cool, go ahead. It doesn't happen very often, actually. Many times they just either silent or they come back with a question. And it may be a question that results in what we call a clinical hold, which is you cannot start this protocol until you have answered all these questions. Sometimes they can also be non-hold issues. It's like, hey, go fix this, but go ahead and start enrolling patients if you want. So possible actions after IND receives it, that they may request additional information, and that may or may not result in placing the protocol on a clinical hold. And you really cannot start the research until all those concerns are addressed. Luckily, actually they do allow in email conversation. It used to be that you had to do formal submissions, and just with snail mail, it just takes a while. But now they do require an official secure email address, and it depends a little bit on campus whether your email is considered secure or not. It's one of those IT things. So, come on, really, the FDA is really concerned about security. And so you can kind of do a back and forth with the FDA, and then they actually, typically in our experiences, they want you to succeed and not have to go beyond that 30 days. So if you kind of start this back and forth with them, the discussion, and you resolve it within that time, they're like, okay, go ahead and start enrolling if you want. Now, sometimes they may conclude that the project is actually exempt. You didn't need an IND, which then you kind of, on one hand, you're like, oh, that's nice. On the other hand, man, I did a lot of work. So the research may actually be conducted without an IND. Sometimes that's what they conclude. And I'll talk about some examples in a little bit. But, what can usually happen is that it's called passive activation. So you're not going to get a notice that says go ahead. It's just if silence means you're good, which makes everybody really nervous. So if you allow 30 days from your filing and there's no comment, you can go ahead and start enrolling. In our office, I was not personally associated with this protocol, but I've heard the story from Penny. They started enrolling a patient. 2 days later, the FDA came with a clinical hold question. So then they had to go back and fix things with those subjects. So right now, kind of our modus operandi is, let's go ahead and confirm with the FDA, we're good, right? And then they say yes. So common reasons to have a clinical hold is that human subject exposure to an unreasonable and significant risk of illness or injury. And this is probably a difficult one to overcome. If you just propose something outrageous, risky, unless you have a really good justification, that probably results in a hold. We haven't run into this issue. Now, sometimes we have run into this, is there's incomplete information to assess the risk to subjects. We did one application with a gene therapy protocol here on campus, and the FDA was of the opinion that the toxicity study that was done was not appropriately blinded, and that the picking which animal was going to die on which day was not sufficiently random. So it's things like that. We're like, well, that was not completely random because of this and this, what's in the report. So we don't think this is a legit study, and therefore we cannot legitimately assess the risk to a subject, yes or no. Now, we actually went back to the original contractor who did the toxicity study, and in the end, we actually got it worked out. We didn't need to redo the study, but that's just an example. The FDA looks in detail in all the information you present. Now, maybe you have a deficiency in your protocol, and we get that a lot, where they said, we actually would like you to add this inclusion or exclusion criteria, things like that. And those are easy to fix. You just update your protocol, you set in a new one in, and they like it. If you have a misleading, erroneous, or materially incomplete investigator brochure. So if you have a study that is executed at multiple sites, you need what's called an investigator brochure, or sometimes it's also called a package insert. So if it's an approved drug and you want to maybe test it for a new indication, it comes with the package insert, right? You buy the ibuprofen at the CVS and you have that sheet with the teeny tiny letters that says you're going to lose your hair and be vomiting all day. That's the package insert, and it has all these, kind of information. You want to have something like that, either the package insert itself or what's called the investigator brochure, which is just it's when there's no package insert yet, which has all this information that if you send that package insert to another institution where they do part of the protocol, the investigator should be able to read that and get a sense of, what's the risk associated with this drug, things like that. So this needs to be a good document. And then we haven't run into that here. Obviously, we only hire really good people at UAB. If the clinical investigator is unqualified, I don't see how that would happen here at UAB. So let's talk real quick about the types of INDs that exist. So the main one that we typically use is sponsor-initiated. And again, a sponsor can be an investigator, it can be a company that wants to do it, and they've approached UAB as, hey, can we do a clinical trial at your site? Or UAB or investigator-initiated when you have an R1 or maybe some internal funding and you want to do usually that's a smaller scale study in humans. Now the other type is what we call expanded access, and it can be either an emergency IND or it cannot be an IND where you just want to, maybe the typical traditional IND has a certain age range, especially in pediatric patients. Let's say you only want to study this new drug in patients between 2 and 12 years of age. And now you have a baby that comes up and is 1.5 years old, and you want to study, and this baby wants to study this drug. That will be an expanded access. So, you kind of have to give reasons to the FDA why you would like that baby to receive the experimental drug. And it just depends on what the kind of disease is, if it's an emergency or not. So it can be for a single patient. And so sometimes you have to apply to the FDA for just a single patient IND. So a whole new IND for just that one patient. You get a separate IND number, things like that. So that also includes the 30-day wait. Now, sometimes you can actually also what we call single patient protocol. So an IND can have multiple protocols under its umbrella. So, for example, with the baby example, this was a gene therapy protocol where we use a modified virus to inject it directly in brain tumors. We wanted to treat a patient that was a little bit younger than the inclusion criteria. We could just slide in a new protocol under the existing IND for just that one patient, and we didn't have to wait. And it's kind of a little crazy when you think about it. So there's, for some reason, the FDA just has a 30-day wait period for new INDs, but not for new protocols. So then it's up to the discretion of your IRB, investigator, and so on, if it's ethical to do. Go ahead.
So if you have an IND kind of covered something, it's related like the second one, but just because the age or something that really belongs to them, you can use the second one.
Yeah.
Then you don't have to wait.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. And actually I have a little schema on the next slide because we were working through this actually a couple months ago with this particular protocol, and we finally got our head straight, how everything works. Because when you go to the FDA website, there's almost too much information. and you drown in the guidances and things like that. So we figured out kind of what the flow chart is, what you want to do and how. Now, sometimes you can also do expanded access in a more widespread or intermediate patient population. And we actually have 2 trials on campus that use exactly that, and that's the CBD trials, the cannabis oil that's used for epilepsy treatment. We have a pediatric study and an adult study. So the company actually already was using this CBD in different institutions and so on, but not for this particular exact patient population. So we did an expanded access trial. And that's actually, it recently got approved by the FDA to actually treat these seizures, like 2 weeks ago or something like that. Then there's also a relatively new type of IND. It's called an exploratory, or sometimes a phase 0 IND. And this is usually mostly to look at pharmacokinetics of new drugs, using maybe radio-labeled drugs. And the trick here is that you use very small doses of something so small that a reasonable person would not expect any adverse events to happen with it. So it's less than 100 microgram per dose for a small molecule. And there's different rules for can you just do 1 dose or can you do multiple doses depending on what kind of toxicity data you have. But it's sometimes really nice to do a quick study, especially with maybe PET tracers or things like that. Let's just administer this to patients and see what's the half-life, so that you have a first sense of is it actually worth doing even larger study in a patient population. And this is, I hope you can read this. Oh, that's terrible. It doesn't project well, sorry. This is my handy-dandy flow chart. I'll kind of walk you through it. So the expanded access options, if you just have an individual patient, you can do a single patient IND. And there's actually a special form for this. It kind of says, this is my patient characteristics. This is the reason why I think this investigational experimental drug would benefit them. And you submit it to the FDA. You need to have a letter of authorization of the manufacturer. So if it's a company that makes the drug, they need to give approval for you to test this in this particular patient. It cannot just be the Wild West where a company doesn't have any control over what happens with investigational drugs. You need to get IRB review and approval, and of course you need to get informed consent. Now this does have that 30-day wait, but you may proceed earlier if the FDA says it's okay. But let's say it's an emergency. You don't have 30 days. You can actually call the FDA as a physician, and they can give you authorization over the phone. But you still have to do a written submission within 15 business days, and you need to report to your IRB within 5 working days. Now, you could also do a single patient protocol, and that's what we used where we at UAB were having the IND. We had 1 protocol already. We could submit a new protocol. So just UAB as a sponsor could just submit a new one, and that eliminated the waiting period, no waiting period. So the FDA must have received it, though. It needs to be tracked in their mailing room as evidence that you actually submitted it. And then, of course, you need IRB review and approval. Again, if it's an emergency, you can call the FDA to get authorization, but you still need to do a submission within 15 days. And if there's no time for IRB approval, you have to report it to the IRB within 5 working days. So they do try to work with you if there's, let's say you have that baby of a 1.5 years old that you want to have this gene therapy vector given to, and their tumor is growing, and you don't even have a week, you could call the FDA and get this done. So when do you then need an IND? So there's kind of 2 main buckets that this falls into. How do you have an unapproved, completely new product? So it's required for new drugs or biologicals to be used in a clinical trial. But sometimes, and we've done quite a few of these here, you have an approved product, but you want to study a new aspect of an approved drug. So there can be a different indication. Let's use an asthma drug to see if it helps osteoporosis, something like that. That would require an IND. Different route of administration or different dosing if it changes the risk profile. If it's a new combination with other drugs, or if it's a different population. You can imagine something that's approved for adults, and now you want to use it in a pediatric population, you need an IND. So I have a little quiz. Many of you are probably familiar with off-label use, but that is, approved products may be used by physicians outside of their label indications for the practice of medicine. So that's just the discretion of a physician. There's no IND needed. It's off-label use. Totally cool. But that's just on an individual case-by-case basis. and you're actually not using that to support a new, oh, now we can use this asthma drug for osteoporosis, and we're going to sell it for osteoporosis. Shoot. Oh, you had, okay.
So actually, how about an example of metformin for pulmonary fibrosis?
Okay, yeah.
Is that require an IND?
If you just use it as a one-off as a physician,
No, it's for clinical trial.
for clinical trial, yes, probably, yeah. Yeah. And I have, here's, in 2 slides, I'll have some questions
We're actually filing a disclosure to UAB for that.
Oh, great. Okay, IPD. Yeah, will be method of use, new method of use of metformin, yeah. So there's some instances where an IND is not required. And all these criteria, the FDA has laid them out in a guidance document, need to be met. There's no intent whatsoever to support a new use, new therapeutic area, or labeling change. There's no intent to support any change in advertising. Now, we as UAB usually wouldn't do it anyway because we're not a commercial entity, but still. There's no factor such as route of administration, dosage, or study population to significantly increase the risk. There's compliance with the FDA with informed consent and IRB review requirements, and there's no promotion or representation that the product is safe or effective for the condition of study. So if these criteria are met, you do not need an IND. And this is what happened when we sent something to the FDA because we thought it did, and then they came back like, actually, you don't need an IND. Oh, okay.
So you're doing the trial that people were just talking about, metformin for not for diabetes but for pulmonary fibrosis, but you don't plan to try to get the company to change the labeling or change advertising or anything like that, then do you need an IND?
Yes, because it's still a therapeutic intent. Okay. It's a different, it's support new use. So you as the individual won't support a label change because you don't have that authority, but you are supporting a new use, a new therapeutic area. Yeah. So, pop quiz. This was an IND where they wanted to study the therapeutic effect of a food supplement available over the counter. You could go to GNC, buy this stuff, on the progress of type 1 diabetes. Do you need an IND, yes or no? You could just buy it at GNC.
No.
Yes.
Okay, who says yes? Raise your hands. 2. Who says no? 2. Who doesn't know? Who's scared to raise their hand? Come on, play on, people.
No.
All right, in your mind.
It's not a drug, it's a food supplement, right?
Yeah.
Why you need an IND?
Therapeutic intent.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you're gonna, do a study that says this is gonna help type 1 diabetes, and that's how you, ultimately this study is geared towards actually improving quality of lives of patients and so on, you need an IND. And we struggle with that a lot because we can just buy it. But yeah, we talked to FDA and IRB and they're like, yes, you need one. So, all right, here's another one. Study whether the use of Prozac enhances the effects of physical rehabilitation on motor function in stroke patients. So people have stroke, then they need to do rehab, they usually have one good arm and one bad arm, and then you tie your good arm to your body, and with the other one you need to start brushing your teeth. Just to kind of practice your bad arm and do rehab. Would Prozac enhance that rehab success, yes or no? Who thinks you need an IND? Who says yes? I see 1.5. Who thinks no? I see 3. Who doesn't know? Scared after the last experience.
Yes.
She thinks yes. Okay.
It's drug.
Because they want to know the effects.
All right. We didn't. This is the one where we went to because we thought surely, yeah. So we wrote
That's why we needed to come to this lecture.
Exactly, yeah. So this is what the FDA said you don't need one. So it meets all the exemption criteria. Apparently, so when you go through these criteria, there was no intent to support new user label change, and this is where we struggled because we thought this is to improve rehab outcome. And the FDA, I forgot exactly what argument they had that it was not.
I think antidepressants are used very frequently for stroke patients.
Maybe that's why, yeah. Yeah, so that must have been the reason then, yeah. No change in advertising, no change in dosage, there's no same patient population, so yeah, we didn't need one. So that was a lot of work, but we learned a lot. So there is a guidance, one of the bazillion guidances on the website, but here's the link to the active one. It says, do you need an IND, yes or no? And then ultimately, ask the IRB. So the FDA, we've actually asked the FDA who decides if you need an IND or not, if it's at all kind of murky or whatnot, and they say specifically to our faces, talk to your IRB. Your IRB is the gatekeeper. So now, in the case of the Prozac and stroke patients, IRB still want us to apply for an IND, so sometimes they get it wrong, it's not so negative. But what we typically do when people think, I don't think I need an IND, is what we now suggest is we give these bullet points to the PI, and we say, write a little paragraph or 2 sentences for each of these points, submit that to the IND and IRB, and then to kind of help convince the IRB that you don't need one. So that's been helpful. But yeah, ultimately it's the IRB that decides. So now you have to apply for an IND. Ah! People panic. They call us. Can you help? Yes, you do. Okay. And we're still surprised that sometimes people don't know we exist. So spread the word. If you hear anybody, pull their hair out about INDs. We are here to help. So we're supported through the CCTS. So mostly it's forms, like I said. There's a couple of important ones. 1571 is kind of the cover sheet. It has lots of boxes, and I'll share it in a second. 1572 is kind of a statement of the investigator that says, I am doing this trial, here's my signature, and here's where I practice. And then you have to register your trial with clinicaltrials.gov. You don't need to register if you're phase 1 clinical trial, but all the other trials do need to be registered. And again, the CCTS has a support person, Denise McKenzie. She can help with registration at clinicaltrials.gov. I personally do not. Now, it's a good idea when you can, of course, always talk to us, but before you actually start putting the pieces together of your IND, have your protocol finalized. It just makes everything a lot easier instead of still tweaking things in the protocol, because there's different places in the IND where you need to refer to that. So it's just easier when it's been kicked around a bunch by a lot of smart people, and you're happy with the product. And then you should have the informed consent form. It actually goes with your IND to the FDA. So there's lots of paperwork. So we as a university actually still apply on paper. Companies, they have been mandated by the FDA to go to electronic submission. Electronic submission means more than just sending a CD or like sending a file through Dropbox to the FDA. There's actually very complicated software systems that need to be validated and so on, that need to talk to each other. And we looked into, well, what would that entail? And you're talking about tens of thousands of dollars to set that up. So actually, a lot of small-sized companies actually start to outsource this to specialized outfits that know how to do this, because there's a certain format of the document that you need to adhere to that has international standardized guidelines and things like that. So as a university, as a not-for-profit, we actually are exempt from that requirement, so we're doing old-fashioned paper. Now, this is just to kind of give you a difference of, this is an approved product for a new indication. This is probably the diabetes drug that we wanted to treat osteoporosis. So it's, a nice pile, but it's not crazy. This is, by comparison, it's a gene therapy product that I've never seen a patient, and I've never seen a human. So there's lots more data. There's toxicology experiments, there's stability studies and things like that. I just put my UB1 card as a, comparison. And you need to send it in very fancy, specific binders. The FDA even gives you like the website at which you can order it and what the order number is. And needs to have, one copy needs to have a red binder, one a green binder, and one a light blue binder. I guess they are very organized in their mailing room. I don't know. But we keep usually 2 copies here ourselves, one for our office and one for the PI. Sometimes it is helpful to just kind of go back and look back at what you actually submitted. Now, sometimes before you actually submit the IND, you could do what's called a pre-IND meeting with the FDA. So it's a formal way to communicate with the FDA about your plans, and you can get input maybe on the way that you designed your toxicity studies, designed your protocol, things like that. And I think I may have said this in another seminar. Unfortunately, you can't just ask them, hey, what do you think we should do? They're not going to answer to that. What you can do is say, we propose this plan. Do you agree, yes or no? And then the chances are, if they say yes, the chances are higher that they're actually going to approve the IND from the get-go. Now, these are not required. And sometimes the amount of information you need to pull together for a pre-IND meeting, you may as well just go ahead and submit the IND, because it's almost the same amount of work. Now, we had again, I wasn't personally involved with it, but Penny, we actually did in our office some IND support. Now, I think we were doing a trial for a for-profit company, and they had pre-IND meeting after pre-IND meeting after pre-IND meeting with the FDA. And Penny at some point asked him, why don't you just submit an IND? But they were a publicly traded company. And if you submit an IND and you get a clinical hold slapped on your protocol, what do you think the stock is going to do, right? So they wanted to make sure that, they cross all the T's, whatever the letters go, non-native speaker. But so there's some strategy, especially when money and companies are involved, and to what extent you want to have a pre-IND meeting. We've discussed it a few times, but most of the times, because we're not affected whether we have a hold or not, you have to answer the questions, but you would have to answer them anyway. We just go ahead and do the IND.
So if you're running a trial through like an NIH-sponsored grant, but the company is supplying the drug for the grant, who submits the IND?
Many times it would be us, as the UAB would be the sponsor.
So whoever is doing the trial?
Correct.
Not the company who's supplying it?
Correct, yeah. And it happens a lot where, and I'll talk about it in a second as well, I think. So many times when you have that approved drug binder, the small one, it kind of has all the same sections as the big binder, but some sections you just have what we call a letter of authorization, a letter of cross-reference to the other company's files with the FDA. So for example, manufacturing and stability. You just have a letter from the company that says, the FDA has hereby permission to look in our drug master file, but it can look all that up. And it's also a way for the company to keep confidential things confidential, because they don't need to share it with you. They just give permission to the FDA to look into their files, and you are cut out as the middle person. So it just keeps things like manufacturing, tricks and so on, especially if there's intellectual property associated with that, keeps it much more tighter under wraps. So we get this letter of cross-reference from many companies, especially when you supply product. They do this all the time.
Even if the drug has not been approved in the U.S.?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're doing one right now with it's not submitted yet, but with anti-fungus medication. It's approved in Australia. They're doing a study here. UAB is kind of the lead to do a comparison of this particular drug with another formulation. They want to show that it's the same. The company's providing the drug, but UAB holds the IND. And we just have a letter from the company that says, look, and here's our file number, look it up. Yeah.
If it's a food supplement, you still need to let them know about that manufacturer?
Yeah, that was actually a bit tricky because we had a problem of who was going to be the source. How did we had a workaround around it somewhere. I think in the end it was a really common food supplement. It was like glucosamine or something like that, which was on the list of generally regarded as safe GRAS list. So we could, and then you don't need to submit any information. Now, if it's a little bit more tricky and it's not on that list, then you probably need to figure out who your supplier is going to be and work something out that way. But yeah, and that's I think how we got around it. It was on that list, so we didn't need to do it. And every IND, almost every one that we've done on campus, we've done probably 20 now or so. We learned something new because there's always something unique or funky, sounds so negative, but special about it because of our academic institution. So we do things, a little differently than a straightforward industry type trial. So sometimes we just don't know how to approach a certain issue within an IND, and FDA is actually really helpful. You can just call them up and like, hey, can you help me talk through, for example, the manufacturing information of this supplement. So that's how we got on the GRAS list. So that's an example here. There's informal ways of communicating with the FDA. If you're really talking about protocol design and things like that, it is more formal, but you can have some, just email back and forth or a phone call. Now, the benefit of a pre-IND meeting is that it may move an IND through the FDA more quickly and just have that 30 days, you're good. There's nothing awkward that pops up in their review. So the application itself has different sections with certain types of information, and sometimes the information repeats. So this is also something as a PI is typically used to NIH grants. You don't want to plagiarize yourself, right? Like reviewers get pissy, like, they use the same language in the abstract and in the background and in blah, blah, blah. IND is totally fine. You can have verbatim pieces of information because these different sections go to different reviewers. So it also needs to be somewhat of a standalone document, especially if it's a large IND, because there will be a specialist who will just be looking at manufacturing information and stability studies. They're really an expert on that. There's usually an MD will actually look at the protocol. So these different parts kind of need to be standalone. So section 1 is the 1571 of the cover sheet. Section 2, the table of contents, it gets its own section, because especially when you have multiple binders, it starts to get pretty complicated where what is. So you actually need to have this table of contents at a good place. There's a bit of an overview, introductory statement with, this is my drug, this is the indication I want to study it for, and then a bit of a high-level summary of, this is the general investigational plan.
So what's on the length of section 3 and 4?
2 pages, 3 pages, something like that. Then here's your package insert or investigator brochure, and sometimes if it's an IB, it can be easily 20, 30, 50 pages. If it's a package insert, we just download a PDF from the internet and we stick it in. Then section 6, the protocol, that's usually the most hefty part, if it's especially if it's a repurposed type drug, where you have your inclusion-exclusion criteria, this is the design, things like that. Then section 7, CMC, stands for chemistry, manufacturing, and controls. And this is where you talk about how you made the drug, if it's sterile, how did you test that it was sterile, what was your source of the buffer that you bought on May 18th, 2018, what was the lot number. So if you have a new drug that's manufactured, we used to have a biologic manufacturing facility here on campus, and I was a quality assurance officer for them. You have mountains and mountains of paperwork to trace where all your materials came from. And the reason why that is because let's say a certain PBS lot is found out to be contaminated with fungus, you need to be able to go back and pull all those batches that were made with that particular lot of buffer, things like that. Then you have a section about pharmacology, toxicology. Pharmacology is usually pretty, that's kind of like, did my drug cure diabetes in mice? Yes or no? It can be pretty short because this doesn't have to be good laboratory practice quality. It just needs to, you don't need to include it, but typically, you have a little bit of a write-up, this is why we're doing this. And in the toxicology section, this is where you have, again, GLP documentation of this mouse was purchased from Jackson Labs on this day, this mom was this, and his dad was this, and it was weighed Monday, Wednesday, Friday, this was what its weight was, this is when it died, and this is the histology of that particular mouse's liver, things like that. So again, lots of paperwork there. If there is previous human experience, so for example, in the antifungal medicine, this particular medicine is already approved for sale in Australia, you would have a little section there that says, hey, it's for sale in Australia, this is kind of the incidence of any side effects, just information like that. Then there's a section if you're dealing with pediatric populations, radioactive drugs, things that have abuse potential, things like that. Section 11 typically doesn't apply to us. It's biosimilar user fee. It's when you make, let's say, an antibody, its patent is expired and you want to make a similar antibody, well, you kind of need to pay a fee to the FDA. And then section 12 is your clinicaltrials.gov form. So we created a template to help UAB investigators with this. So it contains some stock language like description of the facilities at UAB. So you don't have to go and Google that because you're always like, oh man, where did I find that last time I needed to find it. Links to forms and instructions to forms. And for example, if we use UAB as a sponsor, then we have Chris Brown's name, his telephone number, his fax number, his address. We have that already, right there for you in a template, so you don't have to look it up. So I brought a few copies. So I just wanted to kind of briefly go through it. One myself. I have 15, so maybe share a few. Go ahead and pass those around. And of course, I have this electronically. If anybody's actually interested in IND application, I will send an email this to you. Oh, sorry, yeah, it's like the whole package. Yeah, just grab whatever's like together. Where's my name? So let's start with form 1571, and you can find the number at the bottom left corner of your form. So this is kind of the cover sheet, and it gives the glimpse to the FDA what you're actually submitting. So you may need to share a few packets. It has, okay, who's the sponsor, what's your address, are you doing a phase 1, 2, 3 clinical trial, what's the indication, and then if you look at box 11, this submission contains the following, and then there's a whole bunch of checkboxes. This is actually the original IND, or maybe it's a response to a clinical hold, maybe it is a safety report, maybe it's a request for a meeting. You kind of need to indicate on this form, this is why I'm sending this to you. Then on the back, at the top, you see the contents of the application. So here's all those sections that we just talked about, 1 through 12. And you just check the ones that are included. And then you put in who's your safety person, like a safety monitor or a data safety monitoring board. And ultimately, you have your signature. And again, this is a go-to-jail form. So you want to sign it only when you are confident that everything in your IND is actually up to snuff. All right, so let's leave the other 2 forms for a second and just go to the Word document with all the yellow. So this is how we put this document together, where all the yellow highlighted stuff is things you can just replace with the actual information pertinent to your IND application. So a lot of the stock language you can just leave. And, you know, for example, there's a cover page that says, oh, but this is when I applied for it, this is the title of my IND, this is my drug, and this is what I want to use it for, and here's my information. So then you have your information for Form 1571 that we just talked about, and as you can see, we put in like box 18, 205-934-1294. That way you don't have to look it up. So we try to make it as easy for you as possible. And then the table of contents, we have this Word template where we linked things using styles in Word that this automatically gets populated and generated. And that saves you a boatload of editing on the back end. So that's all automatically done. So then section 3 on page 7, this is where you have your introductory statement. So this says, here's my drug name. Here, this is, you know, serotonin reuptake inhibitor. This is the structure, this is the chemical formula, this is molecular weight. I'm going to give this as a tablet by mouth twice a day, orally. And the broad objectives, just, you know, a couple of sentences, is that I want to study this new drug, or this drug that's used for asthma, I want to study its effect on osteoporosis. And then there's a few, you know, brief summary of the previous human experience. That's kind of what goes more extensively in another section. This is just kind of a high-level summary. So anybody at the FDA should be able to read this and kind of know what you're planning to do. And section 4 is somewhat similar, just a little bit more detail about your clinical protocol, which just says, you know, this is why we want to do it. This is the indication we're studying, and this is the general approach. This is how many patients we're going to enroll, subjects. These are some risks that we need to be aware of, and just to kind of give you a big picture overview. And section 5 is a package insert or investigator brochure. Again, if there is a package insert, it can be a 2-pager because it's just a PDF from the website. Sometimes you need an investigator brochure and it's, you know, multiple tens of pages, or sometimes you don't need one. If you just do a trial at UAB, you don't need an investigator brochure because it's just one site. Section 6 is the protocol. So many times physicians are, of course, familiar with protocols. You can use the format that's in this particular template, or you can just stick in the protocol as you normally have it, provided all the sections are in your protocol as well. Like, you know, what are you doing with significant adverse events? What's your statistical plan? Things like that. Of course, inclusion, exclusion criteria. So then let's go to sections of page 616, investigator and facilities data. So here you have the second form. It's called the 1572. That's the statement of the investigator. In this, you list the investigator and you add the CV of his of the PI, his or her CV. And that's just of the main PI. So many times you have multiple physicians working on a protocol. It's just the main person in charge. That was the address of UAB, things like that. Then we have, going back to the main protocol, there's the CV of the PI on page 619. We have the stock description of the facilities on page 20, and you can just adapt that as you need for your trial. If you're doing a trial of children's, you probably have some facilities data for children's, or maybe Kirkland Clinic or whatnot, but this has some stock language in there just to help you. And then IRB approval and consent form. So if you have IRB approval already, you stick that in here. If not, you just say, we've submitted this to the IRB, and we'll send you the approval letter later. And then you do always, even if you don't have IRB approval yet, you do need to send a consent form, and read that carefully. When we did a gene therapy IND trial, they actually came back with lots of suggestions, or well, there were more than suggestions. They demanded that the informed consent form was updated to not mislead any subject participating in it. Now, section 7, that's the CMC section, so the manufacturing. So if you have a letter of cross-reference of the manufacturer, this is an easy one. It's just like, see the letter of cross-reference from blah, 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 and you stick it in. If not, that's where, the paperwork gets significantly larger, because you need to put on all the information, what the lot number was of the PDS and things like that. And then there is a section 7.1, and they actually will ask you for it if you forget, because we've accidentally, deleted it sometimes. This environmental assessment or claim for exclusion. They just want to make sure that you're not pumping poison in the groundwater. Most of the time, you're like, okay, we don't think this is toxic to the environment, but you do need to have this statement in there. Section 8 is the pharmacology and toxicology. Again, if you have an approved drug, many times you have a letter of cross-reference that the manufacturer says, go ahead, FDA, look in our drug master file. You can look at all the information there. And the same goes for previous human experience. Now, sometimes we do recommend that you have at least a little bit of a high-level paragraph. For example, hey, this drug is already being used in Australia. This is kind of the general profile of it. So it's more like a, abstract of all the information that will be on file with the FDA. Section 10 is only, applicable if you use use of drugs that can be abused, radioactive, pediatric studies, things like that. So most of the time it's not applicable. And Section 11 is never really applicable here. And in Section 12 is clinicaltrials.gov form. And that's the last form that you got in your packet. So again, Denise McKenzie can help you with clinicaltrials.gov, because to my understanding it's a bit of a maze to work through, but we do try to get that to the FDA. And then we, personally, as a group, we started to add this, we call it Section 13 references. This has worked out pretty well for us. So it's not an official section from the FDA, but what we try to do is provide them 10 to 20 key references in the PDF form. Just stick a CD in the back of the submission to the FDA. That it just saves them from having to download files, especially when they're critical references, maybe of use of the product already in other patient populations. So you don't have to provide us PDFs of every reference you've ever used in this whole packet, but to kind of what are the top 10 or 20. And because we've had FDA ask us for like, hey, provide us actually a PDF of this reference that you're talking about, and it just saves that step. So again, tedious, but not rocket science, and we can help you with a lot of this. And I just have like 2 or 3 slides here at the end. So after you get your IND active, how do you actually keep managing it? So you actually need to submit annual reports to the FDA. How many subjects did you enroll? How many did you lose to follow-up? How many adverse events? Things like that. So they're really focused on safety. And we do give you a reminder, but don't rely on us reminding you. You should kind of keep an eye on that yourself too. Now you do have to report serious or non-serious adverse events. If you always put it in your annual report, but any events that's serious, related, and unexpected, so it needs to hit all those 3, need to be reported to the FDA within 15 days of discovery. And they actually cracked down on that. We had a protocol where this fell through the cracks, and they actually, they were not happy. We fixed it, but they take that very seriously. Or if you have sent anything else in your protocol that specifies a different rule for SEs or AE reporting, then you need to follow that. But that doesn't mean, so it can be serious, related, but if it's expected, you don't need to report it. So you could have, like, let's say you do this gene therapy trial for glioma, there's a bunch of really bad things that can happen. But if you expect it and you have it outlined in your protocol, if that particular adverse event happens, it's not reportable. Because you knew it was coming, you told the FDA, this is a likely outcome of doing this. Now, if it's completely unexpected, then of course you do need to go to the FDA. And then you need to maintain required documents, like keep updated files of CVs and things like that. And in monitoring, it's something I don't have a lot of familiarity with, but you can do per subject monitoring. This independent monitor comes to your site and kind of compares what's the raw data entry form, does it match with what's in your database, things like that. And I'm fairly certain the CRISP program within the CCTS offers this service. So you can have somebody at UAB do this for you. And then there's, of course, the Data and Safety Monitoring Board that you can have convene a little more on study as a whole basis. Maybe we need to stop this because of bad side effects, or maybe we need to stop this because it works so amazingly well that we need to stop it because we need to go to the next phase. So that is it. So here's my email address, and then Dunya is hers, dritchie@peace.uv.edu. We're not all-knowing, but we probably know more than you, and we know how to find out if we don't know the answer to something. And we have, like I said, we've done about 20 or so, so we've seen a lot of INDs over the last 5 or 6 years or so. So we can at least give you some examples, help you to talk through a bunch of things. We're not going to write it for you, but I will review it and give you some feedback and things like that. So with that, open up for more questions or applause. I mean, whatever. Right. Question. Yes.
So regarding the IND, so you can submit. If you have a protocol finalized and you're pretty sure the IND is not going to click on it, you could write up an IND.
Yeah.
It'd be better if you submit the IND first, in consent form approved, and then do the IND.
Not necessarily. You can do it in parallel. We've done both. It depends a little bit on the preference of the investigator, or if there's a time crunch. We've had one time where somebody's like, I really need to have proof that it's submitted an IND in order to get my grant funded. Like, this was not an NIH grant, but a foundation grant, and you only gave it to people if they're actually proof that they did their work and got an IND submitted. In that particular case, they submitted just at the same time, because they could, the funding actually wouldn't start till a year after, that particular deadline was due. So it was not that critical to have it absolutely perfect. Of course, we did our best, but should the IRB require changes or should the FDA require changes, we have plenty of time to reconcile that and then get an updated protocol in place with both instances. So yeah, I would say if you have a good protocol and you're pretty sure, it's solid and you had a lot of people look at it, my suggestion would be to just go simultaneously in parallel. Yeah.
No more questions.
Do it.
Although I put in hold on the full project, but still maybe one day I'll be able to second. So regarding food supplements, for drugs, it's finding adverse events, toxicity, it's kind of easier to find. Food supplements, it seems like very like a murky water. Yeah. Even though there are clinical trials using it. So can you find the INDs of if you go on clinicaltrials.gov, you have all these studies using whatever you want to use. Can you find that? Obviously, you've had to have submit INDs for that. Can you pull out their ideas because it's confidential information?
It's confidential information. You cannot find out.
So all the work is off.
Yeah. So if that were the case, you may want to find out who's maybe some manufacturers of the food supplement and reach out to them and just kind of get a sense of, have you worked with the INDs before, or do you have information like that, and just kind of do some asking around. That's probably what I would recommend. Because there's not really a database anywhere where you can go in and just pull that information.
It's all the pharmacology, the toxicology, you have to do from scratch. This is like a huge endeavor. Yes,
and very expensive. Yes. So yeah, there's not and it depends, I think, on the particular food supplement to what extent you need to do that, yes or no.
And can you find for all the toxicology, if it's been approved as a food supplement, the FDA is there information like somewhere publicly available on toxicology, pharmacology, or do you have to do it all yourself again?
I don't think there's a publicly available database. Now, if there's references out there in the literature, you can totally use those. You don't need to do, the data doesn't need to be yours. If it's in the public domain and there's something in PubMed that, describes pharmacology and toxicology of XYZ, you can totally use that.
But if it's not, then you have to do yourself?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, or try to figure out somewhere with wheeling and dialing for dollars and see, does anybody have the information, would they be willing to share it with me? Or at least do a letter of cross-reference. So you need to do some sleuthing.
It's not just a publication, if you said it was safe, you would have to find full pharmacology.
Oh,
how?
Yeah, you get some bit of a gray area. It's kind of hard to give you a hard and fast rule about that. Yeah, but we can sit down and talk about it. See, and again, I may not know the answer, but together we can probably come up with, maybe we should ask A, B, C, and then just kind of be like a private detective. There's a lot of that going on.
Put it aside, but
Yes.
maybe in a few years.
Yeah. Well, hopefully it's demystified the process a little bit. We're here to help. Again, spread the word, because we had a research coordinator call us up 2 weeks ago. I didn't know you existed. You could have helped me all this time. Oh, I love you. So we try to be helpful. All right. Well, thanks. I don't know if there's pizza left. Again, if you haven't signed in when you came in, please bleep your UV card to the little reader, and so we can track who was here. All right.